George was a News Limited cadet, but he swiftly stepped up from tabloids to broadsheet, and since then he's got out of the daily grind and is now a very well-known author. He's here with his latest book, Second Chance. What I like about the way George writes, I think it's a little bit like Annabelle Crabb. You're kind of enjoying the read and loving the language, and suddenly you realise that you learned a whole lot while you were doing that. It's a bit like hiding spinach in the kids' food. What George is asking...
Never heard that before, thank you.
What George is asking in this book is how we keep our good luck going. And as I was reading it, I was thinking of a little thing that happened to our new Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, not long after he rolled Tony Abbott. Bit of a language warning here. He was doing a bit of a walkthrough, and a woman approached him with a piece of advice, which he said was a very good piece of advice. She said, "Don't fuck it up." What George has done in this incredible book is gone right back to Australia's very beginning through our booms and busts and had a look at how we can keep our good luck going. So, without further ado, the consistent message in this book is the links between migration, diversity and economic success. George writes, "The fear of foreign competition used to hinge on the migrant dragging down Australia's standard of living. Now that standard of living depends on the migrant. This is the ultimate irony of Australia's return to an open market and open society, its vindication and the sting in the tail." Can you sum up your thesis for us quickly, George?
Thank you, Tory, and thank you all for coming. And apologies if I'm doing the swivel head from side to side because I can't see the entire audience in one go. What I wanted to do was to reframe our national story, to tell the story from the beginning of settlement as a migration story, not as the story that I sort of, as a kid, was taught growing up in school, that the British arrived as a fully formed host and that everybody that came after the British had to sort of fit in. I think once you view this place as a migrant settlement, it does release you from a lot of the hang-ups about who's in and who's out, and you can start to tell a much more interesting story about where we began as a settled society. I'm obviously not ignoring the dispossession, and I'm certainly not ignoring the people who were first here and have been here for 50 and 60,000 years. But an interesting thing happened to me is I wanted to look at the data, and I wanted to look at the people within the data. And the thing that I didn't know until I looked at it from the start was that you can actually explain our successes and our failures by the extent to which we were prepared to be open to the rest of the world. So the first 30 or 40 years of convict settlement, basically it's a dot at the other end of the globe. It's the literal end of the world as Europe knew it then. Pretty much no stories to tell in a globally significant sense until the free migrants arrived. And then something remarkable happened, certainly in South Australia and in Victoria. Something remarkable happened, and this place that was a prison, an open-air prison for about 40, 50 years, suddenly becomes the world's richest settlement. And it happens so fast that you have to wonder which is our foundation story? Is the First Fleet our foundation story, or is our foundation story the beginning of mass migration? And I know you asked me to summarise it briefly, but...
You don't really need to be brief.
I actually didn't know this because I didn't know enough about the 18th and the 19th century until I let the data guide me to the story. I knew in the back of my mind that we were the richest people once. What I didn't realise was that becoming the world's richest people wasn't about wool or gold in the end, but it was about mass migration. And so that very, very rapid rise, and it's quite a remarkable story if you think about it in terms of all of human history. There isn't another place on the planet quite like Australia that is settled at the point at which the Industrial Revolution and a lot of technological change is happening. A lot of the people that start to come here from about the 1830s onwards are middle class and well educated, and suddenly you're creating a model society out of nothing. And the better story for me as I was sort of looking through the data and then looking through the historical record is, how did this country throw away its almost perfect start? How did we go from being the world's richest people, and we were literally the world's richest people from about 1852 to 1891, sat on top of the global income ladder. There's a statistic that blew my mind when I checked it and double-checked it and triple-checked it. There's a point in the 1870s where income for an Australian an Australian settler, was 60% greater than it was for an American at the time, and 25% greater than it was for a Brit. So we were not just the world's richest people. We were operating in a completely different time-space continuum to the rest of the world. And firstly, finding out what went wrong becomes, a very, very interesting literary journey. But then the other thing is the resonance with the present day. As I said, we'd been the world's richest people for about 50 years, then we threw it away. For the last 25 years, we've been growing without the interruption of a deep recession. The rest of the world looks at us as a kind of a special case. We're not America, we're not Europe. And I started to worry that maybe we were about to approach that same fork in the road that we were at the end of the 19th century. World's richest people then, a role model in many ways in terms of democracy and a very cohesive high-income settlement, and then suddenly we threw it all away. So knowing what I know about the present and knowing what we all know about the way politics has been going the last 10 or so years, I wanted to be able to use the past as a bit of a tool to figure out what could go wrong, A, and B, if you kind of know that, maybe help people not make those mistakes again, because we have been here once before. I guess that's the long answer to a question you asked for a short answer.
That was pretty good. I forgot the housekeeping. I'm a bad chair. I'm Tory Shepherd from The Advertiser. I'm the political editor there. I assume your phones are all on silent because I'm sure you've all been here before and heard that by now. If you're tweeting, the hashtag is ADLWW. Will there be a book signing at the end of the session?
There will be.
There will be a book signing at the end of the session. And there are also out-of-season events for visiting writers. If you're interested in those, find one of the information volunteers about the place, and the bar will be open until 7 p.m. Okay, so look, you spoke a little bit about free migrants. You're probably aware that here in Adelaide, we're very proud of ourselves as sort of a free settler state. We say that's why we all sound like Christopher Pine or Sean McAuliffe.
Is that right?
A little bit posher. Oh, come on, Sean McAuliffe. What's different about South Australia? Can you put us into that context?
Yeah, this is one of the things, trust me, I knew next to nothing about the settlement of each of the colonies. I knew the headlines that you would know coming out of high school, but I wanted to have a really good look at the foundation story in each colony. Because most historians will tell you, in fact, intuitively you know this, a lot of what you start with becomes a habit. I think historians refer to path dependencies, but essentially the way a settlement starts, you do 50, 100, 200 years later, you do start to see patterns of behaviour that relate to the way the thing started. And conceptually, again, as you go through the raw material first and you sort of come up with an idea of Australia, the capital of Australia, firstly at settlement, in its convict phase and its really rough, insular, chip-on-the-shoulder phase is, and I don't expect I'm going to have anyone disagreeing, is Sydney. So Sydney is essentially the place, and it has a lot to do with the way it was founded as a convict settlement, is the place where the chip on the shoulder resides. It tends to be more corrupt. Its politics is what it is.
Anyone from Sydney here?
Okay.
Well, just one, you're safe.
Now, I'm going to get to South Australia, because I'm going to take you via the, counterclockwise, I'm going to take you via the settlement. So you get a convict settlement that has about 30 or 40 years, which is essentially what New South Wales is, where the gender imbalance is unto itself an extraordinary thing. There are literally 3 men for every woman on the first fleet, and by the 1830s, that is still the demography of New South Wales, 3 men for every woman. And it's corrupt. It's got some egalitarian impulses, but it's essentially a pretty rough place. Queensland is founded in the 1820s as a sort of an extension. It's sort of like the new prison after the first wave of inquiry into the way the colonies are conducting themselves. Victoria, which obviously came after, about a year after South Australia, well, technically a year before, but essentially Victoria wasn't formally recognised until after South Australia was founded. South Australia was the first one that was founded on this principle of it being an entirely free settlement. It was designed within an inch of its life, and some of the material, and a lot of you are probably more aware of it in South Australia than, say, we Victorians might, or people from New South Wales might. They thought the idea of the South Australian settlement would be the world's first ideal settlement since Athens. So like a classic civilisation, that valued the arts, that valued
wine.
They valued wine well before the wine came. But in the foundation of South Australia was this idea of the most special place on earth, and it was obviously conceived in Britain. But the first lot of settlers who came here, not dissimilar to the settlers who went to WA a few years earlier, were essentially town folk or city folk, professionals, had no idea about farming, and obviously had no idea about this alien landscape. And the settlement almost failed when it started. And WA has the same story to tell, although WA did go to transportation later. The settlement almost failed, but the idea of South Australia as a free settlement obviously remained. And the first most interesting part of Australia's journey to very, very rapid success, very high living standards, and becoming a role model for democracy was this very interesting competition between Victoria and South Australia, these two, free settlements, having a competition to see who would give the vote first to men aged 21 and over, and who would invent the secret ballot. Now, bear in mind, South Australia and Victoria are undergoing this competition in democracy. Obviously, the Vics invented AFL. It didn't get invented here. It got invented in Victoria around the same time. And the 8-hour day, obviously, was in Melbourne in 1856. But this competition in the 1850s has a lot to do with the way both these settlements were conceived. Both these settlements were conceived on a completely different understanding to New South Wales and Queensland. Both these settlements, but especially South Australia, was conceived on the idea that the free settler comes here. The free settler didn't view themselves as a subject of the British Empire. They viewed themselves as the first citizen of Britain. So they wanted the vote, even though you couldn't get the vote. The equivalent person couldn't get the vote in Britain at the time. They were very liberal in the classical sense, small L liberal. And although something clearly didn't stick, because next to South Australia, once the gold rush was underway, was this even bigger thing, this bigger idea of a free settlement, which was Victoria, where all the people from all the world were coming to very quickly. I found some old journals, old South Australian newspapers that would talk about towns that lost all their menfolk, literally lost all their menfolk to the gold rush. Only women and children, they were leaving families behind, and the infirmed were left behind. And they were wondering whether the settlement after 15 or 20 years was going to collapse because all the energy had gone across to Victoria. I'll give you a quick headline idea of how to read the foundation. By the time you get to the 1970s and 1980s, when I talk about habits of governance, where I talk about the path dependencies, the idea that Don Dunstan had to occur in South Australia and Joh Bjelke-Petersen had to occur in Queensland at the same time has almost everything to do with the way these two places were started. And when I talk about patterns of behaviour, we had the vote here very, very quickly. The idea of this being a free settlement arrived very quickly. The Queenslanders, when they got separation from New South Wales, they had to wait till the 1880s before their democracy started to function in any meaningful form. There was, 2 generations that elapsed in South Australia before they even got started. And of course, by that point, by the time they were getting it, the whole grand idea of this first phase of open Australia, the world's richest people, was about to come to a crashing finish.
And how did the successive waves of migrants affect the way society was formed?
Yeah, this is... as a child of migrants from the Second World War, my migrant experience is a migrant experience of the post-war reconstruction of Australia. But it turns out that the most interesting part of the migration story, the first phase of the migration story, is the 19th century migration story. So the first group of migrants who came here were obviously sent here against their free will, which were the convicts. But the convicts on sort of release, those that, completed their sentence, were given land for nothing. So very quickly the seed was planted, even before the rest of the world knew about Australia, the seed of upward mobility for the wretched poor of the world. And that, believe it or not, that idea was there before America was even conceived in its Statue of Liberty, Abraham Lincoln's sense. The idea of this new settlement as a place where you could rapidly acquire wealth is certainly there by the beginning of the 1800s. In fact, a lot of the very early reports were that people would go to a magistrate and say, I've just picked somebody's pocket, or I've just done this, or I've just done that. Can you send me to New South Wales? And a lot of the parliamentary debates in Westminster at the time was about how people viewed New South Wales, how criminals viewed New South Wales as a bit of a lottery. Like a lottery you were bound to win in the end, compared to the life you had here. But by about the 1830s, the difficulty for the colonial governors, and I mentioned before the fact that there were still 3 guys for every girl in the colonies, and we're talking New South Wales, a bit of Queensland, a bit of WA and a bit of Van Diemen's Land. There came a point in the mid-1830s, and this is around the time that South Australia was conceived, there came a point in the 1830s where they thought, we can't make a go of Australia unless we bring in free settlers. And a very remarkable thing happened. A guy called Richard Burke, who was the Governor of New South Wales in the 1830s, he was very liberal in some respects. He was a Whig, but he was also a bit of a disciplinarian. And so convicts in those days got more lashes per back than any statistical period in the first 40 or 50 years of the convict settlement. So he's a pretty tough guy. But he came up with this idea, and it was a world's first in those days, that New South Wales, and then the other colonies would do this as well, would recruit people. So they would pay the boat fare to Australia. So between 3 and 6 months by boat to Australia in those days, and only 6 weeks to the US. So most people were going to the US. And remember, this is a period, especially in the 1820s and the 1830s, big population explosion in Britain and a lot of emigration in those days. And this is even before the Irish famines. So we sort of came up with this idea that we had to bid for a free migrant. And as soon as they came, this is when like the match was lit and the whole place took off. Our very rapid rise up the global income ladder coincides with the arrival of all these migrants. And you would know from your history books, you know a lot of them. From the late 1830s to the early 1840s, you get Britons, you get Irish, you get German. The Germans obviously didn't have their passage paid, but they came anyway. Parkes and Chisholm and Boothby and all these people just turned up out of nowhere. In the UK at the time, they were unemployed. So you had people that arrived in Melbourne, for instance, in the 1850s that didn't go to the goldfields, who were unemployed lawyers in, say, Ireland, who became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the new settlement of Melbourne. But the funny thing about this particular period of assisted passage migration and essentially open borders, we'll talk about a lot of this contemporary resonances in a sec. But remember, this place was wide open. Obviously, the land had been taken from the original inhabitants. But if somebody decided to come here, there was no citizenship in those days. There was no migration department to stop the boats. A boat turns up, somebody comes ashore, starts a new life for themselves. In this period of very open migration, both recruited and people just turning up, whether they're chasing wool or gold, this was the most cohesive settlement on the planet at the time. And I'll give you a couple of particular examples which to this day still stun me. They went very quickly in Victoria once the Melbourne Cup started in 1861, from crowds of about 2,000 or 3,000 in 1861 to 100,000 by the 1870s. One in 3 Melburnians were at the Melbourne Cup in any year in the 1870s. Now, if you put 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 people together anywhere else in the world, you were bound to have a riot. Knives would be drawn, there'd be all sorts of bloodshed. You had 100,000 people cheering these horses around the racetrack in Victoria, and you get similar stories about what horse racing did in South Australia and New South Wales and Queensland. A lot of these migrants, when they came here with a very, very simple idea. Land of opportunity, which you can't get, you still get today. But the last thing they wanted to do was to import the fight from the old country. So the British and Irish, when they were turning up here, were getting along in a way that you couldn't imagine in the home country. But it's the collection of people in what were very, very rapidly advancing urban settlements. We were almost from the get-go in the 1830s, and especially by the 1840s, the most urbanised place on the planet. 1 in 3 people living in towns by the 1860s. These are quite extraordinary figures for the time we were talking about, and everyone got along. And this was when I again asked the question of how we blew it, which I don't want to leave much in here on what questions you should follow up. This place, when you look at the records through this period of outrageous prosperity with open borders, free trade and mass migration, why would you mess with the formula? And I guess that's really the big question of what went wrong.
Yeah, well, that's kind of getting to the crux of it. So, you know, you have this peaceful migration, booming economy, and then people start to maybe get a little bit resentful. Successive waves resent the next one's. Is it just a kind of they're going to take our jobs kind of thing?
Well, there's a fair bit of this. So one of the things I was trying to do in this book, and to get a chance, if you read it or you get a chance to read it, there are a lot of quotes in the book from contemporary sources in the 19th century and all the way up to about the second half of the 20th century. So whether they're editorials in the Sydney Morning Herald carrying on about how we shouldn't let in any more Irish girls because they're marrying Protestant boys in the 1850s, or about the dirty Chinese, or about later the Germans or the Italians, when you start to read some of these things, I don't mention the contemporary debates, fucking avoid it. Some of the language is so uncanny. The whole idea of we decide who comes to this country, it was uttered first by Henry Parkes in the 19th century. The idea that a mass circulating newspaper would target a racial other, i.e. the most recent arrival, well, that happened in Victoria and that happened in New South Wales against the Irish orphan girls, even before the gold rush. The first people that a population in any of the colonies wanted to stop, I literally wanted to change the law to do something that Britain wouldn't necessarily allow the colonies to do, were Victorians in the 1850s wanted to stop former convicts coming from Tasmania to the goldfields. So the first boats they wanted to stop were from other Australians. Now, you've got to wonder about the psychosis of an island continent. Islanders generally tend at some point to flip out, and my father's an islander. I'm not saying that he's flipped out, but he's from Ithaca, and I get this sense in Tasmania, and I certainly get this sense in back on the Greek islands. There is kind of a point after about a fortnight when you're really enjoying yourself, where you start to feel the isolation. And I just think it's almost a natural part of the human condition, especially the last settled continent. If you place ourselves in the time and place where we were in the 19th century, the last settled continent in the world, becoming very rich very quickly, you are bound to worry about a whole lot of people from around the world finally cluing in to our advantage. And at some point, there is, and it's interesting when this is in not just the political language, but in the popular press. There is this idea that when the populations are in the tens of thousands and the hundreds of thousands, that suddenly 5 million Chinese are going to turn up tomorrow. So there was this catastrophising that started to occur in the second half of the 19th century. When we were very rich, we thought that if the rest of the world knew how well we were getting along, they'll all turn up here tomorrow and collapse the economy, collapse the society. The idea of that sort of foreigner, that unthinking foreign horde, that sort of mass of people chasing the same thing that the previous generation were chasing. So here's a big question, and this I think it's in part of the human condition, that there is at some point where a migrant and their kids have established themselves and they can't see themselves in the next person who arrives. And I think that we're talking human condition here. I don't think this is something that's unique to Australia. Clearly, when you map our trajectory, our income trajectory, our cohesion, all the cohesion you want to look at, Melbourne Cup, the invention of Aussie rules, the 8-hour day, the rest of the world looking at Australia as a role model, there comes a point in about the 1870s and the 1880s where you know that people here are starting to get a bit fussy. They are very, very well off relative to the rest of the world, and they're very concerned about the rest of the world's problems coming here. It's a very interesting point. We think about the 21st century and the fact that we're receiving on our phones and on our television screens all the world's problems in a blink, whether it's the internet or whether it's a satellite from the televised satellite from the 70s or the internet more recently. The idea of the whole world crowding in on us does tend to make you feel a bit anxious about the rest of the world. Now, the period when the telegraph lines were being laid and we were starting to receive news from Europe and from America within 24 hours. It would be printed in the papers within 24 hours of it occurring overseas. Very interesting things happen in the Australian psyche when this news is starting to come at us. We're still going to the football, we're still concerned about who's going to win the Melbourne Cup. And the rest of the world to us is a bit of a foreign place, and we're quite scared of it. Even though we've come from there, literally 5, 10, 20 years ago, a lot of the news that was being received in the 1860s and the 1870s from the rest of the world was being viewed almost like an alien scripture and almost an invasion plan. Whether I've matured or not is kind of off the point. I'm beginning to understand the more I dug deep into our past and removed the blinker of which tribe I was talking about and just had a look at the migrant experience and had a look at arrival, establishment, prosperity, why that particular group is worried about the next group and doesn't see themselves in the next group. It's almost never racial, and it's almost always the fear that the next person is going to take what almost came too easily to the person who came here before them. That's when you mentioned before about people wanting to undercut the Great Australian Wage, there was always a concern from about the 1830s, 1840s especially onwards. Now, here's some stats which blew my mind when I read them. In the 1850s, and there were sort of rolling global recessions and depressions going on in the 1850s, even at the bottom of an economic cycle, a labourer in Sydney, and this is not the goldfields, this is a labourer in Sydney, would earn 2 to 3 times more the equivalent labourer in New York or in London. And to an Australian, and you're conscious of this because your newspapers are telling you this, if you can read, and at the time if you can read, and you're living in houses, if you are living in a house, not a tent, if you're living in a house, you live in the biggest house that any worker is living anywhere in the world, you are going to worry that the next worker that's coming here is going to be prepared to work for somewhere between what they earned in New York and what they could earn in Australia. They're going to pull down your wage. And that thing is applied, it's almost a consistent thread. It's almost it's the dark side of egalitarianism. This big high-wage society very, very quickly is aware of how different it is to the rest of the world and is worried that if the rest of the world found out what we were sitting on, this big pot of money, they'd want to come and take it from us. Naturally they'd want to take it from us. How dare they? But B, there's also a sense that the money did come easily to the people who arrived here first, and they thought that the next worker would be hungrier than they would be. And I think there's also a recognition between migrant and the established children, the Australian-born children, that it comes a little too easily for that group, and they do worry about the hunger of the next arrival.
So that's a bit of a killer cycle. Whereabouts do you think we're sitting in the cycle at the moment? Okay,
so I think when I talk about us being at the very top of our earning power through the 1850s, 60s, 70s and 80s, very, very creative period in the 19th century in Australia, before America became this idea of America. So I look at the framework, and the framework is at the very, very top of the boom. And there was a big land boom in Melbourne, and there was a big land boom in Sydney in the 1880s. That was around the time we wanted to stop the Chinese from coming here. The first draft of White Australia was written. Suddenly the world's richest people get hit by a depression. It's a global shock. They didn't handle it well. 2 things happened to them. Firstly, house prices, land values collapsed by 50% in Melbourne and 25% in Sydney. We're talking the 1890s now. Probably not too hard to connect the dots. I'll talk about Melbourne and Sydney in a minute today. But the other thing that happened was, having stopped the Chinese and having decided that Europeans were not white, and both these thoughts happened at around the same time in the 1880s, when the economy did hit the floor, there was no recovery story for Australia in the 1890s or the 1900s, because we didn't then do the thing that we'd been doing almost consciously and unconsciously and naturally for the previous 50 years, which was recruit. When the money ran out, when the gold ran out and the wool ran out, we didn't then keep looking. We stopped, and we thought that people would keep coming anyway because we were fearful they'd want to come and take our high-wage society. What actually happened to Australia at this point is that the rest of the world forgot about us. And a lot of migration that had been split between the US, obviously they got more in proportionate terms because they're a bigger country, whereas in the 1850s, 60s and 70s we could look to British and Irish and get as many, adjusted for population as the Americans would. In the 1870s and 80s and 90s, the Americans are getting Russians and Germans and Poles and Austrians and then later Italians, and we're not doing any of this. We haven't gone to the next wave, and we haven't been able to recover from what otherwise would have been just a deep recession, which was the land bust at the end of the 1880s. The question for the present day, and this is a very interesting question for the present day, so the backstory, previous book, but a lot of people have written about this, that we haven't had a recession for 25 years. The most interesting part of our contemporary story is the story since 2008. And we know the politics has been diabolical, but since 2008, the only thing that explains our continued growth since the end of the second mining boom, so the second mining boom ends at around 2011, South Australia has almost been in recession the last couple of years. Victoria has almost been in recession the last couple of years. Tasmania has already been in recession. Queensland is close to recession. So the economy is actually spluttering and has been spluttering for a number of years. The only thing that explains growth for the last 7 or 8 years is migration. Now, the interesting part of this story is in the past, if the economy was getting weak, what would happen is that the government would reduce the intake. Gough did it. Keating did it. And both those times, those recessions turned out to be a little deeper than they needed to be. I can tell you this as an economist. Now, this is actually what did happen. We did this at the end of the 1880s. We stopped migration and then we couldn't get the place going. And it took us, not just the 20 years to recover from the Depression. Remember, then a First World War comes, then we had a pretty ordinary 20s, then we have another Depression, then we have a Second World War. It took us 50 years to get back on the horse. We didn't just realise in the first 10 or 20 years of white Australia that it wasn't working. It took us half a century to figure this out before we started going again. The story of the last few years is that the door has remained open, partly because of the way the skilled migration program works. An employer is looking for a worker, can't find a worker from the local population because that labour supply is pretty much exhausted. They bring in another migrant. The other migrant comes in. It's a skilled migrant from China or from India or from Britain or from America. By the way, footnote, but a very interesting footnote. There are more Americans in Australia today than there are Lebanese. The American-born population in Australia is at its highest proportion since the gold rush. So I put us where we were in the 1870s and 1880s. The rest of the world is aware of us in a way that would surprise you. Like, people are leaving the US for Australia. They are emigrating from the US for Australia. But the point of where we're at now, we do the hypothetical. If the economy slows, what do? Do we shut the door? History tells you if you shut the door, you're going to stay on the bottom longer than if you keep it open. That's just the basic standard economic analysis. The difficulty is, politically, it's almost impossible, if you do have a slowdown, to be able to control the political impulse to blame somebody other than your own population, i.e. to blame the next arrival. So I don't want to get into the prediction game, but I'd really, really start to worry if another global shock came. Now, what are the coordinates for a global shock? So we've avoided the American-led GFC, the double dip in the global economy from the Europe sovereign debt crisis, we've avoided that. There's kind of like one sort of big, gigantic economic entity that's left out of this story, which is China. So it's kind of their turn, isn't it, you would think? They've been carrying the global economy for the last 7 or 8 years, not just in terms of carrying us in terms of their demand for our minerals. They're migrants, they're emigrants coming to Australia are carrying us. So we're actually in a pretty good position with the Chinese because we sell them stuff that they can't get anywhere else, and they send us their best citizens. The Americans have to buy off the Chinese because the Americans don't have anything the Chinese want, and because the Americans are in the middle of this big white America thing, Chinese aren't going to America to the same extent that they are coming to Australia. Anyway, so what would happen if China hit the wall and it was an inevitable, you couldn't get to 26 years or you couldn't get to 27 years? What's wrong in the domestic economy that would make a global shock impossible to cope with? And the story, unfortunately, is the story, it's not an Adelaide story and it's not a Hobart story, it's not even a Perth story. In Sydney and in Melbourne the last 4 or 5 years, the housing market is beginning to look like it looked like in the 1880s. Different order of magnitude, and there are a number of reasons why you wouldn't think there'd be an epic bust. But migration and the housing cycle, they're the things that are propping us up at the moment. But the difficulty now in the housing cycle is the last 4 or 5 years, Sydney house prices have gone up on average 15% a year since the end of 2011. And the apartment market's gone up about 10 or 11% a year. I've got this data spinning in my head because I've just finished a quarterly essay on it. halve that figure for Melbourne, and then assume 0 or 1% or 2% for everybody else. So those two, and these are the two migrant capitals of Australia, they're still booming, but their property markets are overvalued. And when your property market is overvalued and you've got the risk of a global shock, our history tells us we can handle one of those two things. So, yeah, we can handle the GFC, or in the past we've been able to deal with, runaway house prices in Sydney. But the combination of China sending a shock to us plus an overvalued domestic property market, in the past our history says that those episodes don't end well. And unfortunately, and I'm an optimist, a big open Australia guy, unfortunately, if you use history as a tool here, we are at that critical juncture where if something went wrong in the rest of the world, the stuff that we've been doing to ourselves the last few years, the indulgences of the last few years, the bad politics of the last 10 years, it's the combination of those two things that could cause a problem for us. And then phase two is the consequence of that, we start to close off as a country.
So a lot of the housing price stuff has been the subject of some pretty febrile discussion in Canberra lately.
I've noticed.
But not so many people at this point, in an election year, talking about immigration. We've had a change in Prime Minister and a change in tone, but not a change in policy at this point. Is there something that do you feel optimistic? Has there never been a more exciting time to be George Megalogenis? Do you think we'll get a...
What, as a son of migrants?
Yeah.
I don't know.
As someone who wants to see...
Do you know what's interesting about the last few years? And I've described it as the Rudd Gillard Abbott era. No disrespect to hometown Julia Gillard fan base. There might be a few of you here. The interesting thing about the last few years, some wacky things have been said by the three of them. When Sol Trujillo left the country as the former chairman of Telstra, Kevin Rudd said a thing only a Queenslander could say. You know, he made a Mexican joke. We're all Mexicans to Queenslanders, of course, because all Southerners are Mexicans. But he said adios amigo or something, which you could not say anywhere else in the world, but Kevin thought this was quite a cool thing to say. Mark 1 for insular Australia. Point 2 was Gillard. When Gillard was talking in that election year before she lost her job about how she wants to leave the Australian worker at the front of the queue, that was clearly a dog whistle on the skilled migration program. In between that, in the 2010 election campaign, there was actually a brief population debate where Scott Morrison was running around saying he was going to cut the intake. He was immigration spokesperson at the time. And then, of course, Abbott wanted, to relax the Racial Discrimination Act. He wanted to give, people from the, let's call them politely, the established Australian-born Anglo community the right to call people from recent arrived background or from an Indigenous background something that might offend them, but it's okay because we're going to have a free debate about this. So between the three of them, they've been sort of nodding to this weird thing that is in the community at the moment. And I'll tell you, it's quite a stark thing when you read it. People blame asylum seekers for congestion in Sydney. An asylum seeker in Manus Island is not the reason why Bob Carr didn't build a train line in his 10 years as New South Wales Premier, right? That's not the reason. But in their heads, they blame the asylum seeker for urban sprawl and congestion. They don't blame the skilled migrant so much, but they do blame the skilled migrant for other things. They think that the Chinese are outbidding them for inner-city properties. Now, the three leaders who are sort of occasionally maybe trying to bend with the wind, maybe trying to walk both sides of the street in the migration debate, did one good thing. They kept the program open. They kept the doors open. Even though they were sounding weird on this topic, where you actually measure them, did you let more people in? They did. Did you let them in at levels not seen since the 1850s? They did. I'll give you, don't want to bore you with too many statistics, but the last 10 or so years, more than half our population growth is explained by migration. We're receiving more people than we're making babies. Net of people passing away. The only other time in our history where more migrants arrived where the population increased more from migration than from natural birth was the 1850s, the gold rush. So this is, you could quietly give Rudd, Gillard and Abbott a slap on the back for doing this, for actually allowing this thing to happen. And it's happening quite dramatic. It's happening in South Australia. So when the census came out in 2011, there was still this idea that South Australia, and especially Adelaide, was lagging. You are almost at the cusp of joining the sort of Melbourne-Sydney conspiracy about creating the world's first high-income Eurasian society. It's quite a terrific thing to behold. So the three of them let this happen. Turnbull, weirdly, even though he wants this to happen, he's going to tell you he wants it to happen, may be governing in much more difficult economic circumstances. So I know what his instincts are. His instincts is to go for broke. So when he talks about embracing the future, you know, viewing the transition optimistically, part of his story is to stay open. So he's a markets and a multiculturalism guy. But the difficulty he will have trying to manage this, if the unemployment rate goes from 6 to 7 and then to 8, and I'm not saying it will, but if it goes from 6 to 7 and then to 8, somebody at some point is going to say, why are we letting all these people in?
Tony Abbott.
Even though he let him in before. Yeah, he might say it. If he's not in jail before then. Sorry, that's a joke. It's not going to happen. He's not going to lock him up. He might be saying it from prison.
He might be.
Sorry, I can't say this. I didn't say this. No one's tweeting.
No one's listening. Don't worry. You're fine.
We'll talk. We should talk about that thing later. I'm going to ask you a question about that.
Oh, you're going to interview me about that?
Yeah,
sure.
I'm gonna ask you
No, that
about
sounds fun.
So yeah, it's he's sort of right rhetoric, but he may be in a more difficult period. Here's one thing I always give John Howard credit for. After he dealt with Hanson, and he had difficulty dealing with Hanson, by about 2001, when one of his kids was having a birthday party at the lodge, he noticed that half the son's friends were Asian. And suddenly he went, I think I really stuffed this one up. I did an interview with him in 2002, and I got a lot of grief from it from so-called progressives who thought I was letting him off the hook. I was more interested in his view than what I thought of what he'd said in the 80s and 90s. He said he was wrong about Asian migration, and he said it for the record. And then he demonstrated it by putting the migration program in a position, you know, a very quick potted history since the end of the Second World War. Cornwall told Australians that there'd be 8 or 9 Britons for every 1 European. It turns out that the Greeks, Italians and Yugoslavs outnumbered the British in the period of the 50s and 60s. So the European wave overtopped the British wave. When the Asian wave was about to overtop the European wave in the 80s, Howard said we should slow Asian migration in the interests of social cohesion. And then Hanson said we were in danger of being swamped by Asians in the 1990s. But what did Howard do as Prime Minister in that period from post the Tampa election, from between 2001 and 2007? He suddenly ramps up the Asian intake. So I always give him credit for this. It took him a long time to think that this was what you should do, but he did it. But of course now what we've got, and this is what we were sort of alluding to before about Turnbull, he would do it, but maybe the difficulty he might have politically is he will tell everybody that this is in our best interest at the time where people are feeling a little uncomfortable about everything. And it just may be harder to manage. So
yeah, I think that's possibly right.
It's not just the art of the possible. At some point, a leader has to let everybody else who's sort of not part of the new arrival set, let them know that it's okay. And sometimes they do it in clunky terms. Sometimes they'll do it by pretending they're not letting anybody else in. Labor would tell you from their polling, especially in places where migrants didn't go, Queensland for instance, they would tell you in their polling that they thought that the Tampa meant that no migrants were coming to Australia. But they're coming at what eventually became record numbers. But people thought because he'd stopped the boats that no one was coming at all. Anyway, sorry, a bit of a divergent, but it's an interesting...
No, it was an interesting divergent. Look, we're going to go to questions in a sec, so if you can start making your way to the microphone. I'm just going to throw in one last question, which is, you know, the common critique, I guess, of openness of Big Australia and immigration is the infrastructure, you know, people getting backed up in traffic in Sydney, and also environmental effects, you know. So could you talk us through just...
Yeah, so this is a very... I must admit, I still don't know about our carrying capacity as a continent. I don't know. I don't know what... See, people tell me, you're on this Big Australia kick, you know at some point we're just going to run out of arable land. That's possible. So I don't actually know what our carrying capacity is. But if you knew what our carrying capacity was, and it was just a little more than what we've got now, that is quite an extraordinary debate to start to have. Like, you want to be pretty sure that the evidence was right, because then you would have to do something quite dramatic to our entire society. It's not just an economic question. You would have to almost completely reconfigure Australia to cope with that. Now, I do have a particular case study in the book, and I repeat it in some from different detail in the quarterly essay. New South Wales decided, because Bob Carr is an environmentalist, he decided that Sydney was full at the turn of the 21st century. So he had this active policy of discouraging people from moving to Sydney. Now, a lot of people left Sydney, refugees from the Sydney property market of the early part of the 21st century. If you came here, if you went to Tassie, if you went to Victoria, a lot went to Queensland and then later WA. Population growth was pretty slow in New South Wales, and economic growth was pretty slow. The slowest state in the first decade of the 21st century was New South Wales by a long way, even slower than Tasmania. What happened when people didn't come, even though people were coming from overseas, they were losing as many as they were picking up to interstate migration. What actually happened was, with slower population growth, the demand on government to build roads, open new train lines, basically secure the water, for some political reason, the New South Wales Labor Party convinced itself, because it didn't have to manage a booming state, it could worry about its stuff, which was sort of politics and corruption and all that other stuff. And what happened to poor old New South Wales, even though it's running this allegedly more sustainable model with Sydney full, is its infrastructure was crummy. It started to crumble. Victoria, in a different setting, because a lot of people did go to Victoria, both from overseas and from interstate, it forced the government to do things that otherwise wouldn't have done. Now, the Victorians haven't done too well on infrastructure, but they're in a better position than New South Wales are. When the people come, you almost are forced as a political system to build for them. When you make the other choice, which is a sustainability choice, and thinking we can't take any more people, politics, this is why I'm more open than closed, because I don't trust the political system with closed. I don't trust the political system with protection. I don't trust the political system with this phony idea of environmentalism, because it is a phony idea when it's expressed by politicians. It is, don't bother me anymore, don't let anyone else in, I don't have to do anything more, we'll be fine. I think a lot of things go right in Australia when we're open, when we're pushing. And I think if people come, also never underestimate the skills they bring with them. A lot of the problems we've got to solve have to be solved from a perspective of openness. And this is the other big lesson of our history. The period when we were closed, we didn't hold on to what we had at the end of the 1880s. We lost it, and we never got it back. The only time we were in a position to get it back was after the Second World War, once we opened the doors again. So when Australia sat at the very top of the global income ladder, from the 1850s through to the end of the 1880s into the early 1890s, we were falling, and we were falling quite sharply by the time we federated. We were the worst performing Western economy in the 1920s. We were Greece when the Depression came, because the Bank of England sent its advisors to tell us to cut the pension and to cut wages by 20% across the board. The governments had to balance the books, and unemployment went to 30%. What happened after the Second World War, and this is quite a remarkable thing, even within the closed economic model, we grew faster than America did for the next 20 years, simply because we opened the doors again. And that place, obviously some environmental issues by the 70s, but that place was more vibrant, more functional, solved more problems, had better scientists, had better thinking, basically, than the country that was closed in the preceding 50 years. And I would argue probably quite confidently that if you tried the White Australia experiment, but in its 21st century manifestation, which is sustainability, if you tried it again in the 21st century, you'd blow this joint up. Like, it wouldn't function.
Wow,
sorry, before we go...
Oh, yeah, no, go.
Sorry, can I, because I'm not match fit on daily politics, but what the hell is going on with that leaking? What is going on, Tory?
What is going on? Well, obviously we have no idea where it might have come from, but yes, this highly classified defence white paper...
But a Prime Minister has called the cops on a former Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Is that the headline?
Exciting times.
Am I right? Is that what's happened?
Times. I don't think you can directly say that, because that would insinuate that the former Prime Minister was to blank.
No, I'd take his word for it. He didn't leak it. But
leak it.
essentially,
He was happy to talk about it, though. Pretty happy to talk about it.
we gave a for-the-record quote against a leaked document.
Indeed.
In my day, if you had the leaked document, you then didn't go to anyone who could be closely associated with the story to ask them for a quote. In fact, you wouldn't quote anyone. You'd say it fell out of the sky. Sorry, I just had to ask that question.
Let's get back to you. Hi. Sorry, just a reminder, very, very short questions, and make sure they're questions. Thank you.
What's your present take on negative gearing?
Oh, you got another hour? Very simple story.
Very topical.
It's a very simple story, to be honest. That from an economic perspective, what happened when they halved the capital gains tax at the end of the 1990s, we went from this position where over the entire landlord population, there were more positive than negative gearers. So there were more profits being reported to the tax office than losses. And if anyone has seen the table, Gabriel Chan's got this brilliant explainer on the Guardian website. Call it up. There's a particular graph which Saul Eastlake from the ANZ, formerly the ANZ Bank, I don't think he's at the ANZ now, gives you. And it shows the line doing this. Basically, this is the rents exceeding interest expenses. Right up until the point capital gains tax is halved. Combination with negative gearing, there's a collapse. So we go from a position, and I can give you the stat, since in the 21st century, each year for the last 12 years that we do have statistics, a bit over $5 billion a year has been lost across the entire landlord class. They actually didn't lose the money. They took it off. They took it out of your pockets. They took it out of my pockets because they asked the taxpayer to subsidise them. Two things negative gearing and capital gains tax have done. They've actually pushed the home buyer out, the first home buyer out. We have more investors than any other society on earth at the moment. 15% of all taxpayers have more than one property. But the home ownership rate has fallen at the same time, and we're not building enough houses to meet the demand. So the thing has created a huge distortion. It's one of the reasons why Sydney property prices are elevated, and in Melbourne as well. I think Labor's policy, whilst it's kind of okay, if they'd done this in 2009, we wouldn't be having any problems at the moment about a potential bubble in Sydney. But because they're doing it now, it's sort of after. The big problem at the moment is elevated property prices in both those capital cities, driven up by investor demand. The Reserve Bank can't do much about it because they can't increase interest rates at the moment. So what's my thought on negative gearing politically? I cannot, for the life of me, believe that Malcolm Turnbull's gone for the scare campaign. And Malcolm Turnbull wants a fully functional 21st century vibrant economy. He would know better than anybody else that there's a distortion in the tax system. The distortion is that way too much investment is going to the speculator. Just think of what would happen to that money if it was actually invested in something productive other than being sunk into a second, third, fourth and fifth loss-making property. Sorry, that sounded like a sermon, but it's a pretty hot topic at the moment.
Alrighty, next, thanks.
I watched and very much enjoyed the series of 3 television programmes you made that went out on ABC in January. One of them, I think, was entitled something like Making Australia Great.
Is that your question?
No, that's all right. That wasn't my title, but that's the title of the ABC.
As well as enjoying today's talk and the series, you didn't define great.
What is great? That's a good
what
question.
is great? Yeah. Is it being military strong? Is it being
no,
the richest? Or is it being the most decent? Very interested to know how you define it.
The latter. So the idea of Australia as a world-class, egalitarian, fair-go, free society, to make Australia great, there's a lot of things that still need to be done. But one of the things is to put Australia in a position where the rest of the world can look to us and go, in their particular political systems, see what the Australians are doing, we should be doing the same. Now, one of the reasons why I say this in particular, some American officials I was talking to a couple of years ago, when the climate change thing became an issue in Australia, when we were going from world's best model to undoing it completely, a couple of them said to me, do you realise how hard it is for us to do stuff when we don't have you to point to? So if even the Australians who have these great natural advantages can't be progressive, and I don't mean progressive reform-minded, if you guys can't do it, it's almost impossible in our system to get stuff done. And of course, our political debate is, we have to wait for everybody else to get the settings right before we sign up to things. A great Australia, to my mind, is Australia's not afraid of the rest of the world, but is also not afraid to lead. Now, I don't mean lead as in the, we strut the world stage and tell everyone how to do their business. It's how to improve what we know works here. And whether people pick up on that or not is really up to them. But that Australia is actually a safer Australia, less likely to be blown up than the Australia that wants to play all the other dirty games that everybody else in the world, because we're not big enough.
That's what I hoped you'd say.
Thank you.
In your book, you often compare Victoria, I think particularly, with California in the 19th century.
Yeah.
So if Australia hadn't reneged on its migration, do you think we could have become a great power of the world like America is today?
See, I wonder, here's what I wonder. I'm not sure. See, the Americans could have got a couple of 100 million and more because all the hinterland could be settled, and by the time they got to California, they'd sort of run out of California, but at least they got there. Our settlement tended to stop for not just the migration part of it, but it was certainly true by the end of the 19th century that all the arable land, given the technology at the time, had been farmed, and you were always going to go to a very difficult position after that where you had to start doing some pretty brave things to continue to settle Australia. And I think what happened politically, it was just easier not to. If we had kept the door open, so there's a statistic I quote, at the very, very top of our sort of earning potential in 1887, 1888, the Victorian statistician looked at the growth in all the colonies of the previous 10 to 20 years and then just projected forward, and he got to a population of more than 200 million by 2001. And this was before the colonies had federated and before the colonies had even reached 4 million, 3 million. New South Wales and Victoria about 1 million each at the time. So on the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s scenario, it was just a straight line up. Now, obviously that curve came down because of the First World War, Depression, Second World War. So your question is, could we have become a great power? I don't think we would ever have been big enough somehow, because I think 7, 8, 9 tenths of Australia is literally uninhabitable still. But I think we would have been, I think we've spent the last 70 years trying to get to where we were going to get to anyway. So what you're looking at today is a version of something we could have been in the 1920s or 30s. Now, that country would have been an interesting country because would we have chosen to go into which conflicts? We're obviously going to get dragged into the Second World War, probably the First World War, but we certainly wouldn't have gone to Vietnam and we wouldn't have gone to Iraq because our interests would have been a little more eclectic. They wouldn't have been as sort of as good guy, bad guy, binary as they would have been to the Americans, for example. So I don't think we would have ever become a really big country, but I think we would have been a much more important country if we'd kept the doors open.